Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NASIG 2020 session, Full Text Coverage Ratios, a simple method of article-level collection analysis presented by Matthew Goddard from Iowa State University. Please refer to Schedule for a complete biography of Matthew. We will be using the Zoom Q&A for questions during the session. Afterwards, please also participate in our online discussion forum, which can be located at the NASIG website with additional questions or comments about this session. NASIG's Code of Conduct applies to all discussions and presentations. The links to the forum and Code of Conduct are available on the NASIG website. Please tweet about this session using the NASIG hashtag NASIG 2020. And I would like to thank the NASIG sponsors for helping us make our online conference freely available. I will now turn it over to Matthew.
Great, thank you so much. Good to see everyone, figuratively. I'm really grateful to NASIG and all of the conference organizers for this opportunity to talk with you today about full text coverage ratios. And I'm especially happy that they were able to fit me into one of these live sessions, because I really do want this to be a two-way interaction. And that's because essentially I have an idea, and I've thought about this idea a lot, and I've talked to a lot of people about this idea. And I've used this idea to help solve some tricky problems, but this is really my first real opportunity to submit this idea to the broader profession. And I'd like to use this opportunity not only to share this idea with you all, but to get your feedback. So I'm really delighted to see the incredible turnout as well, because I think I'm going to try to leave at least a few minutes at the end when I'll get to hear your thoughts, in addition to answering any questions you might have. And I'm hoping that with so many people on the call, we'll get to spark a really healthy, good discussion that I'm hoping will continue on the discussion forum on the NASIG site. So with that in mind, I'd like to just suggest some questions that you might think about as I describe this idea, and that you might answer or help answer or provide feedback on during the Q&A. So just some things to think about. And as thoughts occur to you, feel free to put those into the Q&A, and we'll deal with those at the end. But is this a valuable idea? How might this idea benefit your library's users? How might you apply it in your own context? How might this idea be improved? What are some applications of this idea beyond what I'll be describing today? I'm also really interested to hear from anyone who may already be using some form of this idea, because really what I'm going to be describing is so simple, and at least potentially so valuable, that it's been really hard for me to believe that it's not already being used somewhere in some form. So if you know of anything, definitely I'd be very interested to hear that. So just to give you an idea of where we're headed, I'd like to start out with some brief background on what led me to this idea, and then I'll describe the idea itself. What is a full text coverage ratio? And I'll follow that by describing some basic prerequisites and premises behind the full text coverage ratio, as well as acknowledge some of its limitations. Once that's all over with, I'll finish up by describing some real-world applications of this idea that I pursued at my own institution, and then, of course, we'll have some time at the end for the two-way Q&A that I was just describing. So with that in mind, here's just some brief background. I recently moved across the country to become the e-resources librarian at Iowa State University, go Cyclones. But before that, I spent many years at California Baptist University in Riverside, California, go Lancers. And it was at CBU that I did most of my thinking about full text coverage ratios. And without going into too much detail here, the most relevant facts about CBU to my presentation today are these. So CBU has well over 10,000 students, around 160 degree programs, from bachelor's through PhDs, including an online division, and a grand total of 6 librarians. And after my departure in April, that went down by 1 to 5. So as someone with broad responsibility for our collections, I needed an easy way to quickly assess how well we were serving each of these many programs. And even if you aren't experiencing that kind of extreme librarian to student ratio, I'm guessing that you might be able to relate. So when I would talk with CBU faculty about our collections, the conversation often turned to our serials holdings, of course. And as you can imagine, despite our best efforts, not all of our faculty were 100% satisfied with what we were providing. So I, of course, would enthusiastically ask them for just a short list of the most important journals in their field that we were missing. And I told them we would get right on it, and I meant it. But I very rarely received such a list, and I think I know why. In general, I think they simply didn't have such a list. They didn't think in terms of journals. And maybe a factor here is because CBU's faculty is largely a mix of early career researchers and teaching faculty. But like our students, they had, it seemed to me, fully internalized that paradigm of information seeking where the article is just about all that matters. But of course, just about all of our journals' assessment and evaluation was based on the container, the journal. So I wanted to come up with a way to evaluate what we were providing that would align better with our user behavior. And like I mentioned earlier, I also wanted to get a better handle just on how well we were serving each degree program. So it was those sorts of thoughts that led me to this idea of this full text coverage ratio. So with that background out of the way, let's talk about the ratio itself. It's an incredibly simple metric for evaluating the strength of holdings at the item level within a given subject area. Its only functional requirement is a web scale discovery service with a relatively precise awareness of what content is available to your users in the form of the kind of full text filter we're all, I think, very familiar with. And I'm going to talk more about these two specific requirements a bit later. And also, in addition to these two factors, as with so many things in life, it's also helpful if you have a student worker who can assist with gathering the data. Okay. So what is a full text coverage ratio more specifically? Here's the incredibly simple definition as I would offer it if I were asked to formally define this concept. So given a search that approximately represents a given subject area, the full text coverage ratio is the ratio between the number of items that are available and the number of items in the total set. So again, very simple. There's a couple more ways of describing this idea. So out of all possible relevant items Y, our library holds X. So our full text coverage ratio in that case for this domain is X divided by Y %. Or roughly X divided by Y % of all items published in this area are available to our users. So that's kind of the basic idea that we're talking about. And using this very simple number at CBU, we were able to answer, or at least begin to answer, questions like these. So which of our undergraduate programs are best supported by our serials collections? Which programs do we need to invest more in? How much impact will Journals Package X have on our support of degree program Y? How much would cancellation of Journals Package A have on our support of degree program B? And I'll talk more in a little bit more depth a bit later about some of these applications, but hopefully these questions start to give you an idea of just how helpful this kind of an idea might be. So I just gave you that sort of formal definition of what a full text coverage ratio is, and hopefully that was clear, but I'd like to make it a little bit more concrete. So let's look at an example, and we'll walk through the exact steps of calculating one of these ratios. So let's say that the biology folks across campus are doing a program review and they've asked for some input on the level of the library support for their biology major. And you could use some boilerplate text about, how many e-journals the library holds, that kind of thing. But you could also supplement that information with the library's current full text coverage ratio for biology. And that, of course, means that you'll need to calculate that ratio, but you don't mind, no sweat, because that task is going to take you less than 5 minutes. So here's how that might be done. So first step, simply formulate a search that approximates the body of scholarly output relevant to a particular academic program. So in this case, you're going to define a keyword or a set of keywords that is approximately representative of the subject area of biology. So the idea is to identify some basic term or set of terms that gets at the full scope of a subject area in question. So in the case of degree programs, that could often simply be the name of the degree program. For biology, you might simply search for the term biology. Other degree programs, especially interdisciplinary programs, might require a bit more creativity in this step. Once that's done, the next step is to simply define a search limited to the scope that you are interested in. So in my library, we limited these searches to peer-reviewed articles published within the last 5 years, and we only searched within the subject field. But depending on what you're trying to accomplish, really what you're interested in, your definitions here in this step might be different. Once you've done that, it's just a simple matter of actually doing the searches. So you're going to simply do 2 different searches. It really doesn't matter what order. Those searches are going to be identical in every way but one. One will have that full text limiter applied, and one will not. One will just simply return everything in your discovery index. So once you've done that, for each search, simply note the number of items returned and the number of total items returned by the first search divided by the number of total items returned by the second search equals full text coverage ratio. So again, we're essentially just talking about the percentage of available content as best as we can determine it through a simple search of our institution's discovery layer. So it took me longer to explain those steps than I think it would take any one of you to perform them. So now, at this point, you can report that ratio to the biology department, but on its own, it's not very meaningful. I mean, it's interesting, but it really needs a bit more context. So for example, what does it mean that your users have access to roughly 80% of all peer-reviewed biology articles published in the last 5 years? Like any metric, we need multiple data points in order for any single number to really be actionable. So we might ask instead, or in addition, how does this ratio compare to the library's biology ratio in prior years? Are we covering more or less than we have in the past? How does this biology ratio compare to the ratio at our peer institutions? Are we doing better or worse? How does this biology ratio compare to that of other degree programs at our own institution? Okay, so we can compare full text coverage ratios over time, between institutions, and also between programs. And I think all of those are worthwhile projects, but by far the easiest one to perform is that last one, comparing the ratios of different degree programs. And that's the line of inquiry that I focused on at CBU. And that's the one that just about anyone listening to this presentation could easily pursue right away. And it's also the one I'll focus on a bit later when I talk about some of the practical applications of this idea. But before we get there, I do want to talk about some of these prerequisites and premises behind the full text coverage ratio. As I mentioned earlier, the only thing you really need in order to calculate a full text coverage ratio is the kind of web scale discovery service that I think we're all pretty familiar with by now. Things like EBSCO Discovery Service, Primo, WorldCat, Summon. Just about all of my exploration of this idea was with EBSCO Discovery Service, because that's what we used at CBU, at my previous institution. And I do think that tool has the potential to be a pretty good tool for this purpose for the most part. And one thing that I think I'd like to learn more about, and maybe this is where some of you can provide your own thoughts, is whether some of these services are better for this purpose than others. And I think that is a question worth exploring. So what would make a discovery service better for this purpose than others? There's really not much that you need from a discovery service in order for it to give you actionable full text coverage ratios. I don't know, but I suspect that most implementations of the major services would pretty easily fulfill these criteria. But this is what I thought of as being your major criteria for what makes a good discovery service for this particular purpose. So most basically, the index should represent that complete corpus of relevant published items. And of course, that is indeed what discovery service providers have been putting forward as their major selling point for the last decade and change. You'll also need, of course, that full text filter that's actually based on what's actually accessible. So of course, it should have detailed knowledge not only of your own local licensed content, but open access materials as well. You also are going to need pretty effective deduplication, since the ratio is based on the total number of items returned by our searches. A large number of duplicates could skew our results. And similarly, you're also going to need accurate reporting of total results. So if the discovery layer is being loose with how it reports the total number of items in a search, that could also reduce the usefulness of that ratio. But as long as these four things are in place, I would say that's a full text coverage ratio ready discovery service. And the more these things are in place, the more complete the index is, the more accurate and comprehensive its full text filter, the more effective its deduplication, and the more accurately it reports results, the more valid your ratios are going to be and the more confidence you can have in them. And on that point, I think it's interesting and I'd say maybe fortunate that with the possible exception of number 4 on this list, the same things that make a discovery service a good tool for full text coverage ratios are also on the list of those things that make simply a good discovery service. So we're all kind of pushing in the same direction. Okay, so much for prerequisites. Let's talk a little bit about premises. So what are the background assumptions behind the development and use of these ratios? First of all, I would say we're making an assumption that the discovery service is the most comprehensive index of relevant articles. And hopefully that's a safe assumption. If not, I would say we have other work to do. And also we are assuming that our full text filters are generally accurate. We're really relying on that particular function to give us meaningful numbers. And I think it's fair to say that there's probably room for improvement here in most libraries and in most discovery platforms, particularly when it comes to hybrid open access articles. But in general, I think we all put forth quite a bit of effort to make sure that this is a valid assumption. Speaking of open access, one of the premises of this whole idea is that open access content counts. I'm sure we all agree with that, but one thing I like about these ratios is that they make no distinction between licensed and open access content. So in true user-centered fashion, all that matters here is that the content is available for use. So a bit later, when I show some specific full text coverage ratios for particular degree programs, one thing you might notice is that many of the most highly ranked programs at my institution also happen to be part of academic disciplines that have most effectively embraced open access. So the full text coverage ratio, in other words, is an open access friendly metric. And in that sense, I think it's one of the few things in my professional life that would not be turned upside down by a widespread Plan S style flip to open access. So it's, in that sense, you might say it's future-proofed. Finally, the last premise is that hiding things from users is bad. And I'll come back to this point, but for now, hopefully we can simply agree that in general, this is a true statement. So I want to move on now to addressing some of the, I guess, limitations and potential criticisms of full text coverage ratios. I think the most obvious limitation of this metric is that it does not factor in quality at all. So whatever criteria are used to include something in the discovery layer's central index would be just about the only point where any considerations of quality could generally come in. And I hedge that statement a little bit because you can and probably should limit your 2 searches to peer-reviewed journals. I mentioned that's what we had done at my previous institution. So there is a basic minimum standard in that sense. At least you're only looking at peer-reviewed articles. But if the goal is to present a holistic snapshot of a library's serials holdings in a given area, I'd probably recommend combining a full text coverage ratio, supplementing that with some number based on a more traditional quality-based metric, like the library's rate of holdings in the top 20 journals by impact factor, or something like that. And speaking of impact factors, one thing I want to mention here is that given recent criticism of citation-based metrics, I think perhaps this limitation of full text coverage ratios also has a silver lining. So essentially it levels the playing field, so to speak, between prestige journal content on the one hand and research coming from emerging fields and from the developing world on the other, and treats that all on an equal basis. But more generally, I want to address this limitation by making it clear what sort of metric the full text coverage ratio really is. This metric does not try to perfectly describe everything you might want to know about a library's coverage of a particular area. And if you'll allow me just a bit of a digression, I think no discussion of metrics is complete without bringing in baseball. So I'd like to make an analogy with the very greatest form of athletic competition. So the full text coverage ratio, I would say, is like a batting average. It's simple, it's intuitive, it's transparent, it's usefully descriptive. Number of hits divided by number of at-bats tells you quite a bit about a hitter, even if it doesn't tell you everything. Now, there's another metric that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, wins above replacement, or WAR. If you're not familiar with WAR, but you've read or watched Moneyball, you probably have some idea of what I'm talking about. The idea behind wins above replacement is to combine a wide variety of statistics into an equation that then churns out the precise number of wins a particular player is worth relative to a theoretical replacement level player. So the idea is to have one number to rule them all, the only number any scout would ever need. This is an incredibly valuable number, obviously, but it's not intuitive in the same way that a batting average is. So for example, the WikiHow page, I looked this up, the WikiHow page for how to calculate wins above replacement is the equivalent of 5 printed pages long. So on the one hand, you have metrics that are simple and intuitive. On the other hand, you have metrics that are complex and exhaustive. And I think most people would grant that both kinds of numbers have their place, and the actions based on metrics, any action based on a metric is best when it takes into account both kinds of metrics. So I guess what I'm really trying to say here is that the fact that the full text coverage ratio is more like a batting average than wins above replacement, because it doesn't attempt to include everything you could possibly know about a library's serials collections, that's not a criticism per se, it's just telling you what sort of number it is. It's simple, it's intuitive and transparent, and it is descriptive, but not exhaustively so. There's another potential critique of full text coverage ratios, and that one's based on the fact that it's built on searches. So when I described my method for calculating full text coverage ratios, I bet that some of you were thinking, well now, hang on, this metric uses a single search to represent an entire academic discipline, But every fool knows that there's no possible way to do one keyword search that will return all items within a domain with perfect precision and recall. There will inevitably be many out-of-scope articles returned and many in-scope articles excluded. And that, of course, is very true. And that first step of that process, when we identified the best keyword or set of keywords, that step really does need to be thoughtfully completed to make that search as accurate and comprehensive as possible. However, I was careful to say at that point that the search only needs to be approximately representative. And that's because we're dealing with a ratio. If we were looking only at the numerator or only at the denominator, if we were only looking at the number of items returned in either search, it would be a different story. But because we're only interested in the ratio between the two searches, it really only matters that our searches are representative of their discipline, not that they are perfectly pure and complete. And that's because where there are going to be exclusions and irrelevancies in one search, they're most likely going to be repeated at the same rate in the other search. So the ratio itself should still be accurate. But where this issue does definitely become potentially a bigger problem is when comparing ratios between disciplines, as I'm going to describe a bit later. As long as all the disciplines being compared have a relatively consistent level of, shall we say, impurity, inconsistency, there should be no problem. But I don't think that's the case. Anyone who's ever taught database search methods knows that there are subject areas that are harder than others to isolate with a single search. So for those of us who might want to pursue this idea and develop it further in the future, I do think that we'll want to consider how to maximize the precision and recall of these searches. Okay, so thanks for indulging in those rather extended digressions. If I lost you at any point to another tab of your browser, I hope you'll click back on over, because the rest of what I have to say is, I think, a lot more fun. So I mentioned earlier that at my previous institution, we were able to use full text coverage ratios to get some pretty interesting insights into our support of our many degree programs. And I want to share more about what that actually looked like and how that process proceeded. So the first step was to compile a list of all of our degree programs. Just list them out, divide them between undergraduate, masters, and doctorates so that we can compare each program type within those categories rather than between them. And then just simply formulate a representative search for each one like I described earlier. And that's what you see some examples of here in the first two columns. So you have the program in column A, and you have the search that we defined in column B. Regarding that second column there with the search syntax, I do think that it's a good idea to record the exact search that you used in case you want to do this again in a year or two and you want to be able to make comparisons with that longitudinal data that you'd be gathering over time, or if you want to compare with a different institution and see how their ratio differs. So once you've done all that, with a little help from a student worker who actually can do the work of performing each search, we gathered the actual numbers. We did the searches and reported those numbers. And that's what you see in columns C through E. So just the last three columns there, you have the search that was limited to full text, the search that was not limited at all, and the difference, or I should say the ratio between those, is of course that full text coverage ratio in the last column. So I would describe the result of that first little project as eye-opening and actionable. For example, if you had asked me and all of my library colleagues at CBU to guess which program would have the lowest ratio, I really don't think that any one of us would have guessed English literature. Maybe our English professors would have. I bet they would have. I don't think they would have been surprised to see this at all. Now, around the time that we gathered these numbers, we began new license agreements for 2 different eJournals packages. And one of these was a very large and expensive collection in electrical and computer engineering. And the other was a relatively small collection of journals in social work. And I wanted to get a better handle on what our investment in these 2 packages was actually doing for our overall support of these 2 programs. So I compared the full text coverage ratios for each program before and then also after adding each package. And I would say that the results were remarkable, to me anyway. So our majors related to electrical engineering and computer science went from towards the bottom end of our ranking of programs by full text coverage ratio to very near the top of that ranking. So software engineering, for example, went from being the very lowest ranked bachelor's program to being the 5th best. And that was nice to see because, you know, we were paying a huge amount for that very large package, but it also wasn't really surprising since it was a huge amount of content. What was a little more surprising was the effect on social work of that smaller collection that we added in that field. With a relatively small investment, social work went from being our 3rd lowest ranked master's program to our 3rd highest. So now, not only did we have a sense of which programs needed more attention when it came to our eJournals collection development efforts, but we had also confirmed the value of these new acquisitions. Now, of course, we all want all of our departments to be well supported, and we want every degree program to have what it needs. So my own impulse was to simply start at the bottom, or in this case, what you're looking at from the top of our full text coverage ratio ranking, to determine where to focus on new journal licenses. Just start with the lowest ranked programs and work our way up from there without regard to things like enrollment or research funding. But of course, the fact of the matter is that some programs do count more than others, and it's just not a good use of resources to give a degree program with 4 students the same level of attention as a degree program with 400. So the next step in our full text coverage ratio journey was to add a further dimension to this analysis by factoring in enrollment headcount into how we were looking at the data. So here's that chart for our master's programs. Each dot that you see here represents a master's program, and each program is plotted on the graph according to its enrollment along the y-axis and its full text coverage ratio ranking along the x-axis. So using rank rather than the raw ratio allows us to evenly distribute each program, which gives us essentially our own little action priority matrix. So if you divide this graph into quadrants, in the lower right, you have the programs of least concern, programs that have low enrollment, but that have full text coverage ratios that are above average relative to other programs. So these small programs appear to already be pretty well served by our collections. In the upper right, you have highly enrolled programs that already have high full text coverage ratios. So perhaps we'd want to keep an eye on these programs, but for the most part, they should be in good shape. Now, of more concern are the programs in the lower left quadrant. These are small programs with relatively low rates of coverage. So I would say that these deserve our attention, but not as much as the programs in the upper left, which are the most obvious causes for concern. So these are the programs that have high enrollment, but a below average full text coverage ratio. So if you look at this chart, you'll see that in this case, there's just one dot in that quadrant. And so for us, that was a master's degree in education. And so it was an easy decision once we saw this chart to decide to look into ways of better supporting our master's degree, our education master's students by increasing our coverage in their area for our journals. So this chart is one of my favorite demonstrations of the value of this kind of analysis. At a single glance, you can easily identify those programs that are in most urgent need of better support from the library's serials collections. And while I've divided it into quadrants here, of course, the main idea is that the closer to the upper left corner a program gets, the more deserving of attention it is. So another way of visualizing this data would be like this, with programs in the red zone, the ones in need of attention, and the more deeply in the red they are, the more urgency there should be. Hopefully you can imagine how a visualization like this might be a powerful tool when making budget allocations, evaluating renewals, considering new acquisitions. And once you've gathered these numbers for one academic year, you can repeat the exact same process in consecutive years. And over time, you'll have a handy little longitudinal data set showing the changes in full text coverage ratio per program over time. And programs with consistent downward trends might be singled out for attention. At that point, you'd want to ask, well, why is this ratio going down? And your answer will, of course, either be that your own journal's content in that area has decreased, the amount of content being published in that area has increased, or most likely some combination of the two. So I focused on applying this concept to the level of the degree program, but there's no reason why it couldn't also be applied at broader or narrower levels as well. So for an example of a broader level, you might consider your institution's overall full text coverage ratio, which you could easily determine with a null search, just an empty string. An example of a narrower scope would be to apply it to individual courses or even individual research projects. So just to wrap up here, the full text coverage ratio idea, as I described, it arose from conversations with end users, both faculty and students. And as a librarian, I naturally want to surface as much as possible in discovery and then guide the user to the easiest way of accessing that content. We're in the business of making things accessible, right? Not hiding things. But with discovery services, that's exactly what most of us do. We hide content that is unheld. We hide that behind a full text limiter, full text filter. And of course, that is indeed what our users want. That's their preference. And that's really what a lot of my conversations helped me understand. If it's not immediately accessible, they don't want to see it. So we reluctantly hide things and hope our users will find that checkbox if they need to find things beyond our collections. So at the beginning of my talk, I described the few lines of thought that led me to this idea. Basically, I just wanted a way to quantify our support of individual degree programs in a way that made sense to our users. But I think I also like this idea because I really hate hiding things. And this is an extremely efficient way to answer the question of how much content are we hiding? And that's part of why these numbers are so interesting to me. And I hope they're interesting to you as well. And so I'll just revisit the handful of questions that I suggested at the beginning. If any of you have thoughts on the value of this idea, how you might apply it at your own institution, how you might refine this idea, further applications of it, if you are aware of where this has already been done, anything like that, I'm definitely want to make sure that we spur a good discussion here. So let's see. I guess I'll go into the Q&A.
Yeah, Matthew, this is Maria. I've been looking at the Q&A and it seems like thematically there are several areas, but two areas that really stand out from the questions. One relates to the configuration of your discovery layer. So things like what was activated in the index, did you all turn everything on?
Yeah.
Were you confident you were able to eliminate duplications?
Yeah.
Did you have to do anything to make EDS work better for you?
Yeah, that's a good line of thought and a good set of questions. I think the best way of answering those questions would not necessarily be to give all the specifics of our setup, um, but I would say that in general, the way it was set up. So I had pretty broad responsibility for our discovery layer in my previous role, and I set it up so that essentially anything that would fall into that category of a legitimate peer-reviewed scholarly resource would be in the index, if at all possible, and at the same time that duplication would be minimized. And so those were a set of decisions that were made, not with an eye towards full text coverage ratios, but simply with an eye towards the user experience and you're providing an effective discovery layer. And that's, I think, my main point about that I kind of alluded to this in my presentation, that the things that make a good discovery layer, at least to my mind, that make a good discovery layer, I know there may be differing philosophies on this, but those are also the things that make an effective tool for this kind of analysis. And one thing that I'm kind of curious about is, yeah, I alluded to this as well, the differences between the different products that are out there. And I think it would be worthwhile to dig into the various kinds of setups that they allow to determine what makes a good setup for this particular function in this kind of analysis. And also, if there's ever any tension between the user experience and this kind of analysis, because in my experience, it seems like if you're setting this up for a good user experience to provide a pretty holistic discovery service that has a pretty comprehensive index, but that has effective deduplication and a good just overall user experience, that also lends itself to this kind of analysis.
And so and then another group of questions related to the searches that you did. So how do you actually compare how one term compares to another in your searches, medicine versus kinesiology? Have you tested your assumption about what is retrieved? Have you checked this method doing different types of initial searches? For example, what does just biology miss? I mean, you touched on this a bit, but there are several questions sort of, again, getting at maybe a little bit more, digging in a little further into, how you settled on this is the search that is best representative of an area.
Yeah, and I think that's a line of inquiry that definitely bears further analysis. I frankly did not spend a lot of time refining precisely how that's done. I think I was satisfied with a representative search. And I alluded to this earlier as well, that the idea is not to perfectly return all of the items within a domain, but to return a representative set of items. And so with the example of biology, I guess, yeah, my assumption simply was, and this was what the question acknowledged, is that representing that basic idea with that very common, relatively standard term would return a pretty representative set of results. But I definitely think, I didn't do any sort of systematic analysis of that assumption, and I definitely think that would be an interesting line of inquiry. That's a good point.
And then there was a question, can coverage be related to cost? Is chemistry 30% of coverage, but 50% of the cost? What were your thoughts about that that relationship?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. That's another dimension of analysis that I haven't really thought about how that might be pursued. But you could certainly, you could certainly. It might be interesting to, I showed you the graph of the ratios by enrollment, like per program by enrollment, and it might be interesting to see those plotted by cost, and that might surface some low-hanging fruit when it comes to, maybe there's a very low ratio, but it's in a field with very low, generally low cost, like English, that you could then really take advantage of that insight and really get a lot of bang for your buck, I suppose. So yeah, that's a good idea.
And there have been a couple of, I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, but there have been a couple of comments of people thanking you that, they're changing budget models so that their materials budget ratio of serials to one-time purchases can be balanced university-wide, and they're looking at usage of resources, but they also think that the full text ratio would be an excellent additional metric. And this seems to be useful. I'm chatting with my colleagues as we watch this presentation, and we're already discussing various ways it could be used to assess the diversity in our collection. I'm looking at the questions.
Yeah, I see one here I'd like to answer. Ann Williams asked if foreign language journals are covered equally. That's a really good question, and that's a factor that you might want to consider in that search. Maybe you might want to. I just used the English term, but it might be a better idea so that you do ensure that you're getting all the foreign language journals to just or together some of the equivalent Chinese phrase, the equivalent Spanish phrase, etc. I got around that in our methodology, or I tried to anyways, by searching within the subject field in the hopes that there would be consistent subject indexing, and that might have introduced complications of its own.
Great. So it is 1:05. And Matthew, I want to thank you for your presentation. And I want to thank everyone for attending this NASIG 2020 session. This recording will be posted to our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And Matthew will be monitoring the NASIG forum through June 2020 for any questions not covered during the session. Please join us at 2:15 for our next session. Thank you, everyone.